Chapter 25. Count Me In. The best day of your life is the one on which you decide your life is your own. No apologies or excuses, no one to lean on, rely on, or blame. The gift is yours. It is an amazing journey, and you alone are responsible for the quality of it. This is the day your life really begins. Bob Moad.
Are you insane?
Wes barked at Chris.
Completely certifiable?
Chris was packing a large backpack at the moment, trying to puzzle out how to fit the clips of ammo and the rest of the loose shells in one of the smaller sections. Wes stared at the mounds of packs, as well as boxes of paints and supplies.
You can't just walk out of here with a bunch of...
He waved his hand at the far corner that was occupied with a maze of paintings.
A bunch of art. The roads are still dangerous. The Reformation is a friggin' joke, and you are both going to end up dead.
Chris ignored him. Wes was plain-spoken, and Chris had grown used to that over the years. The older man glared at him for several long moments before stalking out of the tiny house. Chris suppressed a twinge of regret. Despite their difference in age or a host of differences, Chris had found a solid friendship with Wes. Despite his angry facade and harsh words, the man cared for others far more than he could admit, even to himself. Since the raid that had killed his fiancée and the mother of his unborn child, and even before that, years before when his wife Sarah had left him, disappearing into the night with their young son and daughter, Wes had been unable to give voice to the part of him that was good and kind. He rarely smiled, other than a sarcastic sideways smirk, and still called Chris soldier far too often. The older man hid behind his gruff exterior so that others wouldn't get close, so that he wouldn't ever be given love or acceptance, only to risk losing it again. That was what Carrie had once said, and Chris knew she was right. Wes worked hard, spent long hours toiling on the Purdue farm and then heading up to see Jim Dorian, who had recently had a stroke and shortly after that fallen down his rickety old stairs, breaking his leg in the process. The simple-minded man was now in his mid-50s and had trouble understanding why his body was betraying him in such a strange manner. Outside of the stone house, he could hear Wes start his truck up and gun the engine, driving down the rough dirt road and back toward town. They were leaving tomorrow, first thing in the morning. He had hoped Wes would stay for dinner at the Purdue farm, where Carrie already was now, saying her goodbyes. She had put on weight the past few weeks, inching away from the skeletal frame and looking younger and less haunted. It was as if the decision to leave had taken a weight off of her she hadn't realized existed. She had sent letters ahead to the art gallery in Denver, but there had been no response. This wasn't surprising. Mail was still rather spotty, and there were still some routes that took longer than others. The highly efficient system of mail delivery had been lost with the collapse of the country, and they were still struggling to put it back to rights, along with a host of other creature comforts that most people took for granted decades before. That evening at the Purdue's was not easy. Liza, expecting her fourth child, was exhausted and beside herself at the thought of her older sister moving away. The children, even little Abby, were voicing their own distress. Abby climbed into Carrie's lap at one point and said in her tiny baby voice, "Ah, Cree, no go," which caused tears to spring in both Liza and Carrie's eyes. Liza's husband, Carl, said little. He wasn't a talkative man, but obviously, he too disapproved of Chris and Carrie leaving. Chris turned to him at one point in the evening and asked, "Did Wes say if he would be by for dinner?" Carl just shook his head. Chris thought briefly of running into town and seeing if Wes was holed up in his house or at Dorian's ramshackled trailer, and decided against it. Perhaps this was for the best. He couldn't explain it to anyone, not Carl or Liza, not even to himself. What mattered was Carrie. If she thought leaving would make it better, then leaving is what they would do. As it was, he found himself thinking more and more of Belton. Mom, Dad, Jess, and Alan. They were all dead, but the town was probably still there. He found himself wondering about it. How much had it changed? Was there anyone left that he knew? He had resolved to make sure they stopped there, at least for a day before moving on to Colorado, just to see the old house, just to say goodbye properly this time, and take a moment to remember the happier times. He knew that Carrie wouldn't begrudge him that, even if the detour was slightly out of their way. "Chris?" Joseph was standing there in front of him. Chris hadn't even noticed his arrival from town because he was so lost in his plans for visiting Belton. The little kid was now grown into a rather self-assured yet quiet teenager. He was 14 now and had taken over Mr. Lyle's automotive store more than a year ago, caring for the aged-old man, crafting leather-bound books out of deer hide Wes shot and then taught him how to cure. The books were then lined with paper from a printing supply company that had sat abandoned for more than a decade. The kid had weathered Fenton's death, then Mr. Lyle's, less than 2 months later, with a quiet reserve that belied his years. His blonde hair was spiky and short, his haircut a parting gift from Carrie, who wielded more than just a paintbrush with quiet accuracy. The boy had a box perched near the front door. "I brought you more of the journals. Thought you might use 'em for trade." The journals were made from rich cream vellum he had found beneath boxes of envelopes and cheap stationery. The butter-soft deer hide was embossed with his initials. Chris picked one up and ran his hands over it. "These are great, Joe. You really have been improving, and the hide seems quite supple. No more shrinkage?" The teen winced a bit at the memory of his first attempts at curing the hides Wes had brought him. There had been a trial-and-error phase, but he had quickly learned how to mend his mistakes and create quality hides. Books were his first project. Now he was starting on working leather belts. "Yeah, I've got the hang of it now." Joseph paused, looked down at the ground. "I wish I could go with you, Chris." Chris laid a hand over the boy's shoulders, but said nothing. He knew Liza would lose it completely if both of her siblings answered the siren call of the West. He felt a sharp pain in his chest, and he couldn't help wondering how long it would be before he saw the boy again. Tiptonville had been his home for over 10 years, and Joseph was the little brother he never had. That evening, they spent a restless night in the small stone house. One last night of banking the fire, checking to see if there was anything they had missed, anything that just had to be included. The van they were using had been the Carters', Carl's mom and stepdad, but they had given it to Chris and Carrie when they first heard the news that they were leaving. "We barely use it, and it's in good shape and you can carry the gas cans on top. It should be enough to get you all the way to Colorado," John Carter had told Chris. They'd accepted the gift gratefully, then packed the van full of paintings, items to trade, foodstuffs, and a handful of personal belongings. There was barely any room left for them in the front, and even the open space between the 2 front seats was piled high, every inch of space spoken for. As the pale rays of the sun lightened the treetops, Chris scrambled some eggs and wrapped up a fair-sized bag of sandwiches for them to eat on the road. He walked outside just as Wes's truck came rumbling around the bend. The truck had a camper shell on the back, something Wes usually only put on when he was going hunting. It wasn't really hunting season, but perhaps the older man felt the need to kill something soft and furry in response to Chris and Carrie's departure. Chris grinned at the sight of his friend. He had been sick at the thought of not saying goodbye. After all, they had no idea when they would return, if ever. "Hey there, Wes. Come to see us off before you go off on a hunt?" Wes shook his head. "I'm coming with you, you damned idiot." Typical Wes. Kind and heartfelt words were not his strongest suit. "You're what?" Carrie asked, having just emerged from the house with the last of their belongings in her arms. "I'm coming with you. The two of you'd end up dead before you got halfway there, and then damned if Fenton would raise out of the grave and give me what for," Wes said, taking the bundle of food from Chris, who stood there in shock. "Besides," he said, "it's high time I saw more of the world, sides sand and them damn sand—" He glanced at Carrie's stern look. "Yeah, lots of sand. Figured I'd get out and see the world." Carrie burst out. "What about Jim Dorian? He's still hobbled up with that broken leg." Wes nodded. "Yup, dropped him off with Reverend Deeds last night. Jim'll be as right as rain in a few more weeks, and then he can help out round the parish. Besides, they need some help now that little KG is in the world." Jeremy Deeds and his wife Grace had just welcomed their second child, a little girl named Karen Grace, or KG for short, after her mama and grandma just 2 months ago. They already had a very boisterous little boy, Anthony, who adored Jim Dorian. "Dorian needs to be with others. Ain't good for him to be living alone in that leaky old trailer." The older man lifted up the back of his truck and displayed a host of items to trade or sell. "Hell, I gotta get rid of this crap, and you ain't got any more room in that van. The way I see it, you two could use the company." Wes had his trademark smirk plastered on his face. He had thought of everything, it seemed. Chris felt Carrie's eyes on him. This was far from what she might want, but the more Chris thought about it, the more he couldn't help but like it. An extra eye, an extra gun, and despite all his gruff and taciturn ways, Wes was a good friend. "Well, all right then. Let's get moving." A few minutes later, they drove away from the tiny stone house, the van in the lead, and Wes and his truck behind. Within an hour, they were making time down the cracked highway heading west.